mose is a mose.
A rose is a rose.
A toes is a toes.
Doo-doo-doo-doo, Moses, a Moses, his toes a roses, a Moses, supposes, erroneously. He knows his toes are roses, as Moses, supposes, his toes.
Good morning.
We've talked the whole night through.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. Good morning, good morning. It's great to stay up late. Good morning to you.